Robertson. Welcome.
Good morning. One other thing I have the privilege of doing I'll mention is on the faculty for the National Judicial College, so I get to meet judges from all over the land and teach on these actually same topics. So I'm privileged to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, and it's something that not only I think is important, but that I've been working in the field for over 30 years now, trying to help people use tools that change their life. So this morning what I'm going to do in my brief time is share with you some of the research.
Dr. Robertson, could you just take the microphone and just kind of point it towards you, just make sure we get you covered?
Okay.
Thank
How's
you.
that?
Yeah, you're fine. You just want to make sure it's directional.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to share this morning is some of the research on what we've learned that's come about not only in the drug field quickly, but in the criminal justice field on things that we've tried, things that don't work, things that do work, and kind of where the status of the research is today. So one of the things, I also work with NIDA and SAMHSA on drug treatment issues, and in this what we've learned about drug treatment is it's not only environment, learning, but it's also genetics, and that accounts for an interesting number of people having the disease, if you will, and we call it a brain disease now because what we know about drug addiction is it doesn't discriminate, doesn't take many prisoners, and probably the most resounding numbers I was sharing earlier this morning is in this country there's 30 million people clinically chemically dependent on drugs. When you add in problem drinkers and druggers, or abusers, if you will, is another term that we use, there's another 90 million total. So when we talk about those numbers, out of all that, we only have 7.5 million people in criminal justice. And what that speaks to is substance abuse may be part of or a symptom, as we'll see in the presentation, but it's certainly not the only issue that brings people back and forth to criminal justice. And so when we talk about programs, we're talking about substance abuse needs to be addressed, but it's not the only thing that's going to reduce rearrest rates. So when we talk about, I also teach for National Highway Traffic Safety on multiple DUI offenders, and one of the issues we looked at is how do you sort programmatically broad categories that need to be addressed to change people's lives. Those three are motivation, insight, and skills. And so when you sort through those major categories of how you build components to address each one of those is when we start talking about long-term change for people. You can't do any one of them and have reductions. You have to do all three. So things we've tried in criminal justice, we've tried education, and these are issues that we've tried to reduce: recidivism, vocational training, drug testing, court cost, fines, jail, prison, 12 steps, psychoeducational, group counseling, individual counseling, diversion, scared straight, therapeutic communities, domestic violence, boot camps, intensive supervision, day reporting, electronic monitoring, behavioral management, and cognitive programs. Now what's interesting about that list is we've actually tried all of those models on what I'll call our small subset of offenders to reduce recidivism. And out of all those models, we actually have a good bit of research on what works and what doesn't work. And not surprisingly for some of them, confrontation or scared straight programs increases recidivism 24%. So when I teach treatment providers, I said if you're running low on clients, that's definitely the model to implement in your communities. Vocational training alone doesn't do it because we have the assumption as we look at some of these issues that if folks just had a job, they wouldn't commit crime. That's interesting. However, what we learned in one of our own original studies was we had 100 clients, and I'm from Memphis, so I was in the South, and we don't do as well down there vocationally. But we had 100 clients get out, had gone through our substance abuse treatment program, had $30,000 a year jobs walking out of our institution to work on the bridge we were building from Tennessee to Arkansas. And 5 years later, guess how many of those folks were still out? Now, they had a job, they'd been through a 18-month substance abuse program, they had free aftercare for 12 months, family counseling, all of that available. 5 years later, guess how many of those 100 folks were out? None. therein is when we began to look at what in the heck we were doing to help people change their lives permanently. It was not some of our beliefs about what it took. So being the researchers we were, we started interviewing our clients, and we learned more from our failures than our successes, because our successes always tell us that we're doing a great job and everything's great. But it's our failures where we learn the most from. And one of them told us, they said, you know, Ken, why in the heck would I get up in the morning, go listen to somebody tell me what to do that I didn't like? You know, especially since I've been out last night. And furthermore, you know, they expected me to work a whole 8 hours. I'm sitting there going, of course, I'm at work doing this interview. I'm going, I know nobody here has ever had that problem with, you know, their employers, or they expect you to actually work and all that stuff, or you didn't like everybody you worked for. But these people genuinely believed that that didn't apply to them, that they weren't willing to engage in a pro-social way. So when we look at this list, individual counseling, non-behavioral nature increases recidivism and rearrest 20%. And around the country, I can tell you, as I survey programs for the Justice Department, some of this still goes on today, in spite of the data. Diversion, we don't have enough real good hardcore data on. But when we look at things that start changing, it's really behavioral, cognitive, and a combination of those pieces. Then you can add in education. Then you can add in vocational training. Those are models, but it's talking about, once again, it's that motivation and insight that has to be available to get clients, number one, to engage in your programmatics, and number two, to actually acquire what we'll call the internal message. As the gentleman said earlier on the juvenile side, it's the internal drivers that ultimately determine whether or not I'm going to come back. Because the one thing we've done in corrections very well is we build external boundaries around people. And as long as we're watching them, most of the people do most of the things correctly most of the time. But as those boundaries slip away, as they move from institution to probation or parole, and then they move off probation and parole, their decision-making reverts back to them and those internal drivers. And so if there's not been a change in the internal side of the message, then their likelihood of staying and disengaged from the criminal justice system is very limited. So when we talk about, mentioned earlier already, some of the criminogenic needs that need to be addressed is the pro-criminal attitudes, antisocial personality, substance abuse, criminal association, cognitive social skill deficits. Things we don't need to address or self-esteem, anxiety, and neighborhood improvements, because those are interesting and may ultimately contribute something, but they're not the drivers for the folks that we're trying to address. Those are not the drivers. It's the criminogenic needs side of the puzzle and group cohesiveness. So Gendreau, who is a Canadian researcher who's done extensive work in the field of criminal justice for years, published some research that was very interesting, because he was talking about, typically we use the static predictors to determine whether or not somebody's going to come back. And when you talk about loading those factors against predictability, they load the same as on the right side, the dynamic predictors. And the dynamic predictors are things we can't change. So in other words, I can't change somebody's criminal history. I can't change their age. And when you look at those factors, they load fairly heavily for people involved in crime. We know the 18 to 24-year-old cohort is the major contributor to criminal activity. That also goes along with what other things happen in 18 to 24-year-olds? They leave home. Some go to college, some go to work, some go to vocational training, but basically what we're talking about is a group that begins to experience what? Supposed responsible living. That also puts them at risk for what? Criminal activity, albeit minor, but some of those have already had a history of criminal behavior. And as our folks speaking on juvenile issues can attest to, some of our clientele have avoided involvement with criminal justice systems. They may have been asked to leave school, but they've avoided criminal justice systems just to come back as adults. So when we look at the dynamic predictors, the number one is antisocial personality. And what we know about a large number of our clientele is they tend to have an axis 2 or a personality disorder. And as a result of that, that brings them back to the party time in and time out, in addition to the other factors that we see here. Companions. I mean, the one thing that's interesting about offenders that you notice is offenders tend to clump together. They hang out with other offenders. It's kind of like if I'm doing drugs, I want to hang out with drug abusers, right? However, when you start asking them to separate